Emily Carter didn't scream when her stepmother dragged her into the street that morning. She had learned long ago that screaming changed nothing in Red Hollow. She just pressed her lips together, held her spine straight, and stared at the dirt because looking up meant seeing the faces of people who already knew and had already decided not to care. That was the summer everything she had endured finally had a price tag on it. And the man who would refuse to let that price be paid hadn't even looked at her yet. If this story already has your heart, subscribe and follow along to the very end, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning Margaret Voss decided to sell her stepdaughter started the same way every other morning in Red Hollow started, with heat. Not the gentle warmth of a summer sun easing over the hills. The heat of Red Hollow in July was a different creature entirely. It pressed down from above and rose up from the cracked red earth below, and it squeezed everything caught between the horses, the storefronts, the people into something dry and short-tempered and tired. By 7 in the morning, the air already tasted like iron and dust, and the few souls making their way along the main street of town moved slowly, conserving what little energy the heat hadn't already stolen. Emily was already behind the counter of Voss General Store before the sun had fully cleared the ridge. She had been there since 5. She swept the plank floors, restocked the dry goods shelves, counted the coins in the cash drawer, and checked the ledger entries against Margaret's handwritten invoices, not because Margaret asked her to, but because if she didn't, Margaret would find a reason to be angry before breakfast. And an angry Margaret before breakfast meant a very long day. Emily was 22 years old and had spent the last 6 years of her life learning the geography of Margaret Voss's moods the way a sailor learns the geography of dangerous water. She knew which silences were safe. She knew which tones of voice came before the back of a hand. She knew that the way Margaret set her coffee cup down in the morning, gently, deliberately, without a sound, meant the day might pass without incident, and that the way Margaret set it down, hard ceramic against wood, a sharp crack that split the quiet, meant it would not. This morning, Margaret set the cup down hard. Emily kept her eyes on the ledger. "Victor Lang's man came by yesterday afternoon," Margaret said. She didn't look at Emily when she said it. She was standing at the window watching the street, her arms folded across the front of her dark dress. "While you were in the back, doing inventory." "I didn't know that," Emily said. "I know you didn't. I'm telling you now." Emily wrote a figure in the ledger. Her handwriting was small and controlled. What did he want? What he always wants. Margaret turned from the window. She had a face that might have been handsome once before. Whatever had hardened inside her had worked its way out to the surface. Now her features were arranged in a permanent expression of appraisal, as if everything she looked at she was calculating its worth. "Mr. Lang wants an answer." Emily set the pen down. "My answer hasn't changed." "Your answer," Margaret said, and the word came out like she was examining something unpleasant she'd found on the bottom of her boot, "is not the thing being discussed. What's being discussed is the debt your father left when he died. What's being discussed is the $240 this store owes to Victor Lang's lending company, which comes due at the end of this month." She paused. "And what's being discussed is the arrangement Mr. Lang has offered to make that debt disappear entirely." The store was very quiet. Somewhere outside, a horse shifted its weight and its shoes scraped against the dry ground. "I won't marry him," Emily said. "No one's asking you to marry him." "Then what is he asking?" Margaret looked at her for a long moment. Something moved behind her eyes. Not guilt. Emily had long since stopped expecting guilt from this woman, but something that might have been a kind of calculation, a final tallying up of numbers. "He's asking for your contract, a term of domestic service, 3 years at his house under his household management." Emily understood what that meant. Everyone in Red Hollow would have understood what that meant. Victor Lang was 51 years old, twice widowed under circumstances that the town had never discussed loudly, and he had a reputation that the women of Red Hollow passed between themselves in low voices whenever his name came up, the kind of reputation that was never spoken directly, but was communicated in the tightening of a jaw. The quick look away, the subject changed too fast. "No," Emily said. "Emily, no." She picked up the pen again. Her hand was steady. She was proud of that. I will work to pay the debt myself. I will take on washing or sewing or whatever else I need to do. I will find another lender. You will do nothing, Margaret said. Her voice had dropped into that register Emily knew, the way she knew a change in weather low and flat and final. Because you have no legal standing to do anything. You are not on this property deed. You have no claim to this business. You have no money of your own, because every cent you have earned since you were 16 years old has gone toward keeping this store and this roof operating as is right and proper, given that you live under it. She walked to the counter and placed both hands on the surface, leaning forward until her face was close enough that Emily could see the fine lines around her mouth. What you have, Emily, is exactly what I say you have. Nothing more. Emily looked at her stepmother's face and felt the old familiar weight settle onto her chest. The weight that had lived there since she was 16, and her father had coughed his last breath in the back bedroom, and she had realized in the minutes that followed that the woman standing beside her at the deathbed had never seen her as a daughter, had never seen her as a person, had seen her from the very beginning as an asset on a ledger sheet, a line item, a thing with potential value to be extracted. She had spent 6 years learning to carry that weight without letting it show. Give me until the end of the week, Emily said. Let me try. Mr. Lang is coming this morning, Margaret said. She straightened up and smoothed the front of her dress. To discuss the finalized terms. The pen dropped from Emily's fingers. This morning, she said, at 10 o'clock. Margaret moved toward the back room, as if the conversation was over, as if the most significant sentence she had ever spoken had no more weight to it than a comment on the weather. Put on your good dress. She did not put on her good dress. She stood behind the counter in the same gray work dress she'd been wearing since 5 in the morning, and she served the 3 customers who came in before 10 o'clock. Mrs. Hale buying salt and flour. Old Pete Duggan looking for a new length of rope. Young Billy Crawford sent by his mother for a spool of thread, and she was polite and efficient, and her hands did not shake, and she did not say a single word to any of them about what was coming. Because what would she have said, and who in this town would have done anything about it? Red Hollow was not a cruel town in the way that some places were cruel, grinding and deliberate and proud of it. Red Hollow was cruel in the quieter way, the way most places were cruel. Which was to say, it was a town full of people who had learned to tend to their own affairs and to look at difficult things happening to other people with a particular expression that communicated sympathy without commitment. They had watched Margaret Voss work Emily Carter like a rented mule for 6 years. They had watched and murmured to each other in low voices and brought extra food at Christmas and said, "What a shame, what a shame," and then gone home to their own warm houses and their own particular troubles. Emily had stopped expecting anything from them a long time ago. What she had not stopped, not entirely though she knew it was foolish, was expecting something from herself. At 9:55, she closed the ledger. She folded her hands on the counter. She thought about what she might say to Victor Lang when he walked through the door. She rehearsed sentences. She arranged arguments. She told herself that she would speak clearly and without trembling, and that whatever he said she would say no. Victor Lang walked in at 10:05. He was not a large man, which was the first thing people always noted about him, in a tone of mild surprise, as if evil was supposed to come in a proportionate package. He was of medium height, medium build, with pale gray eyes and a neat gray mustache, and hands that were always very clean. The hands of a man who had not done physical labor in 20 years, who employed other people to do his labor for him and kept his own hands clean and soft to demonstrate that fact. He wore a good coat despite the heat. He wore it the way he wore everything deliberately expensively, to demonstrate that he could afford to be uncomfortable and still look better than you. He looked at Emily, and he smiled the way a man smiles when he's already counted the money. "Miss Carter," he said, "you look well?" "Mr. Lang," she said. He moved to the counter with a kind of easy confidence, setting his hat on the surface, glancing around the store with the proprietary expression of a man surveying something he already considers his. "Your stepmother tells me we're ready to settle things." "My stepmother," Emily said, "doesn't speak for me." His eyes came back to her. Something in them sharpened just slightly. "That's an interesting position for a young woman in your circumstances." "My circumstances are my own business." "Are they?" He wasn't asking. He tilted his head, studying her, and she held very still under the weight of that look, because she had learned that going still was better than flinching. And flinching was better than backing away, and backing away was the one thing she absolutely could not do. "The debt belongs to this property," he said. "The property is under your stepmother's legal control. The terms of the settlement have been agreed. What exactly is it you believe you have standing to refuse?" "Myself," Emily said. "I have standing to refuse myself." He smiled again. It was a worse smile this time, slower, and it didn't go anywhere near his eyes. "You are very young," he said, "and you are confused about how things work." He picked up his hat from the counter. "I'll speak with Mrs. Voss. We'll have this sorted by noon." He walked toward the back room. Emily's voice came out before she had decided to use it. "Mr. Lang." He stopped, turned. "Whatever arrangement you make with Margaret," she said, "I won't honor it. I want you to know that before you spend another hour on it. Whatever she signs, whatever she agrees to, I will not go." The smile was gone now. In its place was something flatter and considerably more honest. "Then I will have the sheriff explain the law to you," he said, "and then you will go." He disappeared into the back. Margaret had the papers drawn up by 11 o'clock. Emily discovered this when Margaret came out of the back room, her color high, and her expression composed in the way it got when she had done something she intended to stand behind, and placed a folded document on the counter between them. "It's done," Margaret said. Emily didn't touch the document. "I told him no." "Your telling him anything is not relevant to the contract." "I'm 22 years old. I'm a grown woman. You can't—" "I can and I have." Margaret's voice was still flat, still certain. But her eyes moved away for just a fraction of a second to the window to the street, and Emily felt the faint sick pulse of something she could not afford to feel right now, which was hope. Because that look, that half-second look away, meant that Margaret was not entirely certain, that there was some piece of this that her stepmother was still calculating. "The debt is real. The contract is legal. Mr. Lang has generously offered to—" "To what?" Emily's voice broke just slightly. She pulled it back. "Margaret, look at me. Look at me and tell me you don't know what that man is. Tell me you don't know what happens to women in his house. Tell me you haven't heard—" "I have heard that Victor Lang is a respected businessman who has offered to settle a significant debt in exchange for a period of service," Margaret said. Each word was separate, deliberate, placed down like a stone. "And I have heard that ungrateful girls sometimes need to be reminded that they are where they are because of the charity of people who didn't have to take them in." The store went completely quiet. Emily looked at her stepmother's face. Really looked the way she hadn't let herself look in years, because looking meant feeling. And feeling meant the weight would become too heavy to carry, and what she saw was not hatred. It would have been easier if it were hatred. What she saw was something more pragmatic and more terrible than hatred. She saw a woman who had decided somewhere along the way that the world operated on exchange and transaction, and that the only honest thing to do was to participate in that system without pretending otherwise. She saw a woman who had never not once seen Emily Carter as a person. "I'll find someone," Emily said. Her voice was very quiet. "I'll find a lawyer. I'll find—" "By noon," Margaret folded her hands. "Because Mr. Lang is sending his man at noon to collect the signed agreement and escort you to begin your new arrangement." The heat pressed in through the walls of the store. Outside, a horse blew air through its nostrils. Somewhere down the street, someone was hammering something. Emily Carter was 22 years old and had 2 hours. She went out the front. She didn't take her good dress. She didn't take anything except the $3.40 she had tucked into the lining of her left boot 6 months ago, saved from the occasional customer who tipped for delivery money. She had never told Margaret about, because she had never been able to explain even to herself what she was saving it for. Only that someday she might need to run. Only that it seemed important to have something that was entirely her own. She walked down the main street of Red Hollow with her chin up and her hands at her sides, and she did not look at the people who glanced at her from doorways and windows, the people who knew or guessed or suspected, and were doing what Red Hollow people did, which was nothing. She was looking for the sheriff. She found him outside the barber shop, talking to Cal Merritt about a fence line dispute on the north end of town, and she waited until there was a pause, and then she said, "Sheriff Briggs, I need to speak with you." He looked at her. He was a heavy man, comfortable in his authority, not unkind, but not, she already knew, not a man who would step into other people's arrangements. "Miss Carter," he said, "what can I do for you? Victor Lang is attempting to have me bound under a domestic contract that I have not agreed to. My stepmother has signed papers that I have not consented to and am not party to. I want to know my legal standing." Briggs shifted his weight. Something moved through his face, a kind of careful neutrality settling into place, the expression of a man deciding how much he needed to get involved. "Now, Miss Carter," he said, "debt settlement contracts are a civil matter. If your stepmother is the legal holder of—" "I am not property," Emily said. "I am a grown woman, and I am not a party to this contract, and I did not sign it, and I want to know if that matters." Briggs looked at Cal Merritt. Cal Merritt looked at the ground. "The matter," Briggs said carefully, "would need to go before a judge, which is a process that takes time. And in the meanwhile, if the debt is valid and the contract is signed by the property holder, so there's nothing you'll do." The careful neutrality on his face remained perfectly in place. "There's a process," he said, "and in the process, the existing agreement would likely—" Emily turned and walked away. She heard Briggs say something behind her. She didn't listen. There was no point in listening. She had known, some part of her had known before she crossed the street what he would say. She had asked anyway, because she was someone who needed to exhaust every possibility before she could stop believing in them. She stood in the middle of the street in the July heat of Red Hollow, with 2 hours left and $3.40 and nowhere to go. And she understood for the first time, not as an idea, but as a physical fact. Something she felt in her chest and her throat and the backs of her eyes, that she was alone. That she had always been alone. That the town around her was full of people who would watch what was about to happen to her with that expression she knew so well, that expression of sympathy without commitment, and that none of them would move. She pressed her lips together. She did not cry. She turned to go back to the store and figure out what, if anything, she had left to try, and she walked directly into a man coming the other way. She stumbled. A hand caught her elbow before she hit the ground, a firm grip immediate, and sure gone again the moment she had her footing and she looked up. He was tall. That was the first thing. Not imposing in the way Victor Lang tried to be imposing with his good coat and his clean hands and his deliberate expenses. This was a different kind of height, a kind that came from frame and proportion and years of physical work, and it was paired with the dust of someone who had been riding and the quietness of someone who had learned to take up only exactly as much space as he needed. He had dark eyes and a face that had been weathered by sun and wind into something spare and still, and he was looking at her with an expression she could not immediately categorize, which was unusual, because Emily Carter had become very good at categorizing the way men looked at her. "Beg your pardon, miss," he said. His voice was low and unhurried. "That was my fault." She realized she was still standing close to him because she had not yet stepped back, and she stepped back now. "No," she said. "I wasn't watching where I was going." He nodded once. He'd already glanced away, not dismissively, but in the way of someone who understood that staring was a kind of pressure and did not wish to apply it. She noticed that he noted the barber shop where Briggs was standing. Noted Briggs. Noted, she thought, her path back to the store. Didn't say anything about any of it. "You all right?" he said. It was such an ordinary question that it caught her entirely off guard. Not because no one had ever asked it, but because of the way he asked it without the performance of concern, without the looking away already quality of someone who hoped the answer was yes, so they could get on with their day. He asked it the way someone asks a question they actually want to know the answer to. She opened her mouth, and for reasons she would not be able to explain to herself later, what came out was the truth. "No," she said, "I'm not." He looked at her. The heat pressed down. Somewhere behind her, she heard Briggs laugh at something Cal Merritt said low and easy, the laugh of a man who had already decided the morning's difficulty was someone else's problem. The man in front of her did not laugh. He did not look away. He stood in the full weight of what she had said, and he did not flinch from it, and he said, "Is there something that needs doing?" Emily. Carter stood in the middle of the street in Red Hollow, Texas, in the blazing heat of July 1879, with 2 hours until Victor Lang's man came to collect her, and she looked at a man she had never seen before in her life and said, "There might be, if you have time." He settled his hat on his head. "I've got time," he said. His name was Daniel Hayes, and he had been in Red Hollow for exactly 11 days. He had come down from the North Range with 3 other hands after a cattle drive ended badly, not disastrously, not the kind of badly that made a man swear off the work, just the kind of badly that left him with less pay than he'd counted on and more road behind him than ahead. He'd stopped in Red Hollow because the Callaway Ranch 3 miles east of town was hiring seasonal hands, and because he needed to put his horse up somewhere decent while he decided what came next. He had not planned to stay more than a few weeks. He had not planned on any of this. He listened to Emily Carter in the street outside the barber shop standing in the full press of the July heat, and he did not interrupt her. That was the first thing she noticed about him, that he listened the way very few people listened without preparing his response while she was still talking, without looking over her shoulder to see who else was around. He stood still, and he listened, and when she was done, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Tell me about the contract." So she told him. All of it. She told him about the debt, about Margaret, about Victor Lang, and his gray eyes, and his clean hands, and the way he'd looked at her across the counter. She told him about Briggs. She told him about the 2 hours now closer to an hour and a half. She told him things she had not told anyone in Red Hollow, because there had been no one in Red Hollow to tell. And she was aware, even as she was talking, that she was telling them to a stranger in the street, which should have felt desperate and embarrassing, and instead felt she could not explain this, like something loosening in her chest. Like a knot she'd been holding so long, she'd forgotten it was a knot at all. When she finished, he said, "Do you have the name of the lending company on the debt?" She blinked. Of all the things she had expected him to say. "Lang's Western Lending. It's in the ledger at the store." "And the original loan, was it made to your stepmother personally or to the business?" "To the business. To Voss General Store." He nodded slowly. "Your father's name was on the store." It was his store. Carter's General Store originally. Margaret changed the name after he died. He was quiet again. Not the silence of a man with nothing to say, but the silence of a man thinking carefully. She watched him, and she thought that she had no earthly reason to trust this man, this stranger with dust on his coat and a quiet voice, and that she was going to trust him anyway, because she had run out of other options, and because something in the way he'd asked those questions, practical, precise, without a single note of performance in them, made her feel that he was not asking in order to seem helpful. He was asking because he wanted to understand the actual shape of the problem. "There's a land records office," he said finally, "and a telegraph office." "Yes, on the far end of Main Street." "How much do you know about your father's original filing on the property?" Emily stared at him. "I know he filed it himself in 1869, when he first came to Red Hollow. He used to tell me about it. The first thing he did when he arrived was go to the land office and file his claim." She paused. "Why?" "Because a business debt secured against a property is only valid if the debt holder has clear title to that property. If your father's name is still anywhere in that chain of title, If there's any question about how the property transferred to your stepmother after his death, whether it was probated properly, whether there was a will." He stopped. "Was there a will?" The air went out of Emily's lungs. "I don't know," she said. "I was 16. I didn't—" She pressed her hand against the side of her face, thinking hard. "He never talked about a will, but Margaret took everything from his desk the day he died. All his papers. I assumed—" "Don't assume," Daniel said. "It wasn't sharp. It was just direct. Go to the land office. Look at the filing. See whose name is on the chain of title and when it changed. I'll go to the telegraph office." To do what? To wire the county seat. He was already moving. The deed filing records are held at the county level, not just local. If there's a discrepancy between what's on file here and what's at the county seat, if Margaret filed something incorrectly, or if the title transfer wasn't completed properly, then the debt contract may not be legally enforceable against the property. Emily was moving too now, keeping pace with him, and she was aware that her heart was doing something it had not done in a very long time. Not the sick, heavy thudding of fear, but something faster and less predictable, something that felt almost like urgency of the better kind. And if it is enforceable, if the title is clean and the contract is legal. He glanced at her sideways. Then we figure out what comes next. We. She noticed that word. She didn't say anything about it. They split at the corner, and Emily went to the land office alone. The land office in Red Hollow was a single room attached to the back of the courthouse, staffed by a man named Arlo Finch, who had been recording land transactions in this county for 23 years and who regarded all of them, past and present, with the deep, incurious calm of a man who had seen too much paperwork to find any of it surprising. He looked up when Emily came in and said, "Miss Carter," in the way he said everyone's name, which was to say, without inflection of any kind. "I need to see the original filing for Voss General Store," she said. It would have been filed under Carter's General Store, or under Thomas Carter in 1869. Arlo Finch got up from his chair with the careful deliberateness of a man who conserved his movements. He went to the filing cabinets along the back wall and opened the third one from the left and began working through it with a slow, practiced patience that made Emily want to climb over the counter and do it herself. He found it in 4 minutes. He set it on the counter. Emily read it. Then she read it again. The original filing was under Thomas Carter. Her father's name dated April 1869. That was correct. That was what she'd expected. What she had not expected was the handwritten notation at the bottom of the transfer record, dated November 1873, 2 months after her father's death, which recorded the title transfer to Margaret Lena Carter née Voss under a probate proceeding referenced by case number. There was a probate case number, which meant there had been a will. "Mr. Finch," Emily said, and her voice came out steadier than she felt. "This notation references a probate case. Do you have the probate file?" Arlo Finch looked at the notation. "Probate records are held at the courthouse, other side of the building." She was already at the door. The courthouse clerk was a young woman named Ada, something who looked deeply unhappy to be working on a hot Tuesday morning, and who nevertheless produced the probate file for the estate of Thomas George Carter case, number 1-873-P-1. 1-4 within 6 minutes, which Emily spent standing at the counter with her hands flat on the wood surface and her breathing very carefully controlled. She opened the file. Her father had left a will. Of course he had. He was the kind of man who thought ahead, who planned carefully, who believed in doing things right. Of course he had left a will. The will was dated March 1872, 18 months before he died. It left the property and the business to Margaret Lena Carter for the duration of her lifetime, with one condition written in her father's own careful hand. The same handwriting she had been looking at her whole life, with the provision that any debt secured against said property shall require the written consent of Emily Jean Carter upon her reaching the age of majority, said Emily, being the heir of record to the property, upon the death or remarriage of Margaret Lena Carter. Emily read that sentence 3 times. Written consent. Her consent was required. She had never signed anything. She had never been asked to sign anything. She had not consented. The debt contract Margaret had signed with Victor Lang's company, if it had been secured against the property, and she was almost certain it had been. That was the only thing that gave it value, was missing her signature. Her legally required signature. Her father, who had known Margaret better than Emily, had given him credit for, had written her protection directly into his will, and no one, not Margaret, not Victor Lang, not Sheriff Briggs, had told her it existed. Emily's hands were shaking. She pressed them harder against the counter so the clerk wouldn't see. "I need a copy of this," she said. "The full will and the probate record and the title transfer notation, all of it." Ada something looked at her. "That'll take a little time too." "I have about 45 minutes, Emily said. "Please." Daniel was waiting outside when she came out. She came through the courthouse door with the copies folded against her chest, and he looked at her face, and whatever he read there made him straighten slightly, that particular stillness of his sharpening into something more alert. "What did you find?" he said. She told him. He listened without interrupting. When she got to the part about the will, about the consent clause, she saw something shift in his expression, not surprise, exactly more like recognition, the look of a man who had suspected there was something and had just learned what it was. "The telegraph," he said. "I wired the county seat and got a response back faster than I expected. The loan with Lang's Western Lending was filed as secured debt against the Voss General Store property, which means your signature should be on that paperwork and isn't. Which means the contract Margaret signed today is not legally enforceable," he said, "not without your consent, which you did not give." She stood there in the heat with the copied papers folded against her chest, and she felt the shaking move from her hands up through her arms, and she locked her jaw against it. She would not come apart in the middle of the street. She had not come apart in 6 years, and she would not do it now, not here, not when it wasn't over yet. "Lang doesn't know about the will," she said. "Almost certainly not. If he had, he'd have structured the debt differently. And Margaret," he was quiet for a half-beat. "Your stepmother may or may not know. Either way, she signed a document she had no authority to sign." Emily looked up at the sky, blinking hard, and then looked back at him. "This isn't over. Even if we go to Briggs with this, even if it stops them today, Lang has money and influence in this county, and Margaret has 6 years of practice making my life difficult. This is not the end of it." "No," Daniel agreed. "It's not." "So what do we do?" He was quiet for a moment. Then, "There's a circuit judge. Name of Calloway, not the rancher, different man. He's due in Red Hollow day after tomorrow for the summer docket. If we file a formal challenge to the debt contract today, it goes before him when he arrives." 2 days, Emily said. 2 days. She thought about 2 days. She thought about what Margaret would do when this blew up. She thought about what Victor Lang would do. She thought about the expression on Lang's face when she'd said, "I won't honor it," and he'd said, "Then I will have the sheriff explain the law to you." That flat, certain expression of a man who had never been seriously inconvenienced by a woman saying no. "Where are you staying?" she said. "Calloway's ranch." She almost smiled at the coincidence of the name. Almost. "Then you have a place to sleep for the next 2 days." "Do you?" She looked back toward the main street of Red Hollow, toward the storefront. She could just see from here the faded lettering above the door that still said Voss General in letters her father had originally painted Carter's. The store where she had swept floors since 5 that morning. The store that was, according to her father's will, eventually hers. "I'll figure that out," she said. "Miss Carter." His voice was even, not pushing, not pulling, just present. "You are welcome to a bedroll in the Calloway bunkhouse if you need a safe place to be tonight. Nobody there will bother you." She looked at him directly. "Why are you helping me?" He was quiet for a moment, not avoiding the question she had already noticed, that he didn't avoid questions, he just didn't rush them. "Because what's happening to you is wrong," he said. "And I was standing right there when you walked into me, and I had time." It was such a simple answer. No performance in it, no heroics, no claim to righteousness. Just this is wrong. I was here. I had time. She nodded once. All right, she said. Let's go talk to Briggs. Briggs did not look pleased to see them. He looked less pleased when he saw the documents. He looked considerably less pleased when Daniel Hayes, standing slightly behind Emily's left shoulder, in the quiet and specific way he stood close enough to be present, far enough to be not threatening, and yet somehow communicating a very clear message about what he thought of the situation, explained in the same unhurried voice he used for everything. What the papers said and what they meant, and what legally the sheriff was now required to do about it. I'll need to verify these with... Briggs started. You can verify them with Arlo Finch and Ada Holloway over at the courthouse. Daniel said. The originals are on file. These are certified copies. He paused one beat. Which means Victor Lang's man needs to be told when he comes at noon that there is no contract to collect on. Briggs looked at Emily. She met his eyes and held them. All right, he said after a long moment. I'll handle it. I'd like to be present when you do, Emily said. Another pause. Then, fine. Lang's man was a broad-shouldered fellow named Tate, who arrived at 2 minutes to noon with a receipt form in his breast pocket and the easy confidence of someone accustomed to finding things exactly where he'd been told they'd be. He found instead Sheriff Briggs waiting outside the store and Emily Carter standing beside Briggs with a set of documents in her hands and an expression that had nothing in it resembling accommodation. Tate looked at Briggs. Briggs explained the situation. Tate's confident expression did not change so much as go very still the way things go still before they change. Mr. Lang, Tate said carefully, is going to want to speak to someone about this. Mr. Lang, Emily said, is welcome to take it up with Judge Calloway when he arrives on Thursday. Tate looked at her. She looked back. Behind her, she was aware of Daniel's presence, the same way you are aware of a solid wall at your back, not because it does anything, just because it is there. Tate put the receipt form back in his breast pocket. Mr. Lang won't be pleased, he said. I imagine not, Emily said. He left. Emily stood in the heat of the street and watched him go, and felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Not safety. She was too practical to call it safety, yet she knew exactly what Victor Lang was going to do when Tate came back with news, but something adjacent to it. Something that felt like, I did that. I did that myself. She turned. Daniel was watching Tate walk away, that steady, watchful expression unchanged. He must have felt her look because he turned, and she wasn't prepared for the moment of direct eye contact, which was somehow more immediate than all the previous direct eye contact had been, as if something had shifted slightly in the last 2 hours, and she was only now noticing it. Thank you, she said. He nodded once. Don't thank me yet, he said. Lang's going to come himself this afternoon. She had already known this. She had been knowing it since Tate put the receipt form back in his pocket with that gone still expression. Victor Lang was not a man who accepted the word no from a woman in a gray work dress with $3.40 sewn into her boot lining. He was a man who had a lawyer and influence and 20 years of practice getting what he wanted from this county, and the fact that she had found a legal basis to resist him today would not make him go away. It would make him strategic. I know, she said. You need somewhere that isn't the store tonight. She looked back at the Voss General sign. Through the front window, she could see Margaret's silhouette moving behind the counter back to business, as if this morning had not happened, as if the document she'd signed was still good. Maybe she believed it still was. Maybe she was already planning her next move. I know that too, Emily said. She turned back to Daniel Hayes and did something she had not done and she could not remember how long. She asked for help. Not the practical transaction-based asking of this morning. Not I need to tell a stranger in the street what's happening to me because I'm out of options, but something more direct than that. Can you stay in town tonight? She said. Not for me. I'll be fine. She stopped, tried again. I don't know what he'll do when he comes. And I don't want to not know alone." Daniel Hayes looked at her for a moment with those steady dark eyes that did not perform anything, that were simply there. Simply present the way he was simply present in a way she was beginning to understand was not simple at all. "Yes," he said. "I can stay." Lang came at 4 o'clock. He didn't send Tate this time. He came himself with his good coat and his clean hands, and 2 men Emily didn't recognize flanking him at a respectful distance, not touching anything, not threatening anything in any visible way, just there, the way powerful men brought other men along to remind you of the difference in your respective positions. He came to the store. Emily was behind the counter. Margaret was in the back. Briggs was not present. Emily had not expected Briggs to be present. Briggs had done what she'd asked of him today, and that was more than she'd anticipated. Daniel Hayes was leaning against the wall just inside the doorway, his arms loosely folded, his hat on his head. He looked like a man who had stopped in to buy something and was in no particular hurry. He looked like a man who was not thinking about anything in particular. Victor Lang came in and saw him, and his step didn't stop, but it changed, a fractional change, a recalculation, the gray eyes doing their quick professional inventory of the situation. Then he came to the counter. "Miss Carter," he said. His voice was exactly as smooth as it had been that morning. Credit to him, she thought. He hadn't let it get away from him. "I've had a conversation with my legal counsel." "I'm sure you have," she said. "It seems there may be a minor procedural question regarding the consent clause in your father's will. My counsel believes it's a matter that can be resolved with some straightforward documentation." He set his hands on the counter, clean and deliberate. "What I'm offering is a conversation. A chance to come to an agreement before the matter goes before the judge and becomes a public proceeding." "What kind of agreement?" "A signed consent from you with appropriate compensation, of course, for your cooperation." Emily looked at his hands on her counter. Her father's counter. The counter she had been standing behind since 5 that morning. The counter she had been standing behind for 6 years. The counter that was her father had made sure of it going to be hers. "What compensation?" she said. She saw him relax almost imperceptibly, the way a man relaxes when he thinks a negotiation has shifted in his direction. "A percentage of the debt settled in your name. A personal payment made directly to you, not to your stepmother, some independence Miss Carter, which I understand you're looking for." The store was very quiet. From the doorway, Daniel Hayes said nothing. Emily looked at Victor Lang's gray eyes, and she thought about the women whose names had been mentioned in low voices whenever his name came up. She thought about what domestic service meant in his house. She thought about the $3.40 in her boot, and the will she was holding in her hands, and her father's careful handwriting. 18 months before he died, writing her name into the document, as if to say, "I see you. I saw you coming. I did what I could." "No," she said. The relaxation left Lang's posture. "Miss Carter." "No," she said again. "I won't sign. I won't agree to any arrangement with you for any amount in any form. Take it to Judge Calloway. I'll see you there." The gray eyes went flat. She had seen this expression before this morning when she'd refused him the first time, and it was if anything worse the second time, because now there was something in it she hadn't seen this morning. Not just annoyance, not just calculation. Something personal in it, something that said a woman who kept saying no was not just a legal inconvenience, but a specific offense. He straightened. He adjusted his coat. He looked at her for a long, level moment. Then his eyes moved. Across the store. To Daniel Hayes. "Friend of yours," he said. Emily said nothing. Lang looked at Daniel for another moment, that professional appraisal working. Daniel looked back at him with an expression of such complete and composed disinterest that it was almost remarkable, as if Victor Lang were a weather pattern he had noted and found unremarkable. "I see," Lang said. He picked up his hat. "We'll sort this out properly, on Thursday." He let a beat pass. "In the meantime, I'll encourage you to think carefully about what you're risking. This is a small town, Miss Carter, and small towns have long memories." He left. The 2 men followed him. The door swung shut. Emily put both hands flat on the counter and breathed. Behind her, she heard Margaret come out of the back room. She didn't turn. "You've made an enemy," Margaret said. "I've had one," Emily said. "I just didn't know it yet." Margaret was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice was different, not softer exactly, but stripped of something, the performance of certainty gone out of it, leaving something more complicated underneath. "Victor Lang does not lose gracefully," she said. "Whatever you think you have in those papers, he will find a way around it." "Maybe," Emily said. She turned around. She looked at her stepmother's face, that calculating, hardened face which she had spent 6 years studying. "The way you study dangerous geography." And she said, "Why didn't you tell me about the will?" Margaret held her gaze for exactly 3 seconds. Then she looked away. And that look away, that fraction of a second, that small involuntary shifting of the eyes, told Emily everything she needed to know. Margaret had known. She had known from the day Thomas Carter was buried, had known about the consent clause, had known that the debt contract she'd signed was missing a required signature. Had proceeded anyway. Had bet on Emily's ignorance, on Emily's isolation, on the assumption that a 22-year-old woman with no legal knowledge and no allies would not find her way to the land office and the courthouse and a stranger in the street who asked the right questions. "Go home," Margaret said. "Go to Calloway's or wherever it is you're planning to be. We'll finish this in front of the judge." Emily picked up the papers from the counter. She walked out the front door. Daniel fell into step beside her without her having to say anything, and they walked together down the main street of Red Hollow in the late afternoon heat, and Emily Carter thought about her father's handwriting, and the 2 days until the judge arrived, and the expression on Victor Lang's face when he'd looked at Daniel Hayes, and she thought, this is not over. But for the first time in 6 years, neither was she. They gave Emily a room at the Calloway Ranch that night. Not the bunkhouse which Daniel had offered, but a small room off the kitchen that belonged to Mrs. Calloway's hired girl, who had gone to visit her mother in Abilene for the month. Mrs. Calloway herself, a stout woman, with iron-gray hair, and the direct manner of someone who had been running a working ranch for 30 years and did not have patience for complications, took one look at Emily when Daniel brought her in and said, "Sit down and eat something," in the tone of a woman who was not asking. Emily sat down and ate something. She had not realized until the plate was in front of her that she had not eaten since 4 that morning. She had been running on the specific fuel of sustained fear and urgent necessity. And now that the immediate crisis had been forestalled, not resolved forestalled, she was under no illusions about that. Her body was suddenly aware of the debt. She ate. She did not say much. Mrs. Calloway did not press her to. Daniel came in from seeing to the horses, poured himself a cup of coffee, and sat across the table from her. He didn't talk either. That was the thing about him she was beginning to understand. The silence was never uncomfortable. It wasn't the silence of someone who had nothing to say and was embarrassed about it, or the silence of someone who was waiting for you to fill it. It was simply the silence of a man who was comfortable being present without performing presence. After a while she said, "What do you know about Judge Calloway?" "Enough," Daniel said. "He has a reputation for reading documents carefully and making decisions that hold up. He's not a man who can be bought." "Can Lang try anyway?" "Lang can try anything he wants. Doesn't mean it'll work." He set his coffee cup down. "The will is clean, Miss Carter. Your father wrote that clause deliberately. That's not something a judge overlooks." She turned the fork over in her fingers, not eating now, just thinking. "Margaret will testify that the consent clause was a formality, that I was always meant to be part of the arrangement. Were you? No. Then say so." She looked at him. "It's my word against hers." "It's your word, her word, and the specific language of a legal document your father wrote 2 years before he died," Daniel said. That's not an even contest. She wanted to believe him. She noticed how much she wanted to believe him, and she noted it the way she noted all things. She wanted too much carefully at a distance without letting it become something she counted on. She had learned that wanting things too much was its own kind of danger. "Get some sleep," he said. 2 days is enough time to fall apart. Tonight isn't it. She went to bed and stared at the ceiling of Mrs. Calloway's hired girls' room and listened to the ranch settle into the quiet of night, and she thought about her father sitting at his desk in the back of the store. 18 months before he died, writing her name into a document with the intention that it would protect her. She thought about whether he had known already what Margaret was, whether he had seen it and done the only thing available to him. She thought she might cry. She didn't. She fell asleep instead, which surprised her, and slept without dreaming, which surprised her more. She woke to raised voices. Not in the house outside in the yard, the quality of sound that carries in pre-dawn quiet when everything else is still. She was on her feet and at the window before she was fully awake, and what she saw was Daniel in the yard facing two men she did not recognize in the gray early light, and the posture of all three of them had the specific tension of a conversation that was not going well. She was out the back door in 30 seconds. She came around the side of the house, and the two men looked at her, and Daniel said without turning, "Go back inside, Miss Carter." "Who are they?" she said. "Friends of Mr. Lang," said the taller of the two men pleasantly. He was lean and weathered, and wore his gun belt the way men wear things they use regularly. "We're just delivering a message." "What message?" Emily said. Daniel turned then and looked at her, and his expression said clearly that he would prefer she go back inside, and equally clearly that he had already accepted that she was not going to. He turned back to the men. "Say the message," he said, "and go." The lean man smiled. "Mr. Lang wants Miss Carter to understand that the hearing Thursday is a public proceeding. Public proceedings draw public attention. And public attention sometimes surfaces information that people would rather keep quiet." The smile stayed in place, but the pleasantness left it entirely. Like the fact that a young woman who's been living in her stepmother's house is now spending the night at a ranch with a hired hand she met yesterday in the street. The morning was very quiet. Emily felt the specific quality of that threat, the way it was designed precisely to hit a woman in her most vulnerable place, which was reputation, which in 1879, in a town like Red Hollow, was not just social currency, but something closer to survival. A woman whose reputation was questioned was a woman whose testimony was questioned. A woman whose character was impugned before a hearing was a woman the judge might look at differently. Lang had done this before. She could hear it in the way the words were arranged, too practiced, too precise. "Are you finished?" Daniel said. The lean man tilted his head. "We're just messengers." "Then you've delivered the message. Leave." The two men looked at Daniel for a long moment, the look that precedes either escalation or retreat, the measuring look. Then the lean man touched the brim of his hat in a mockery of courtesy, and they walked to their horses and rode out. Daniel watched them go. Then he turned to Emily. "He's going to try to damage your character before Thursday," she said. "Yes." "Tell people I'm staying here. Imply?" "Yes." His voice was even. "Do you want to go back to town?" She thought about it. She thought about what going back to town meant, back to the store, back to Margaret, back to a situation where she had no independent ground to stand on. She thought about what staying here meant exactly what Lang's men had just demonstrated it would be used to mean. "If I go back to the store," she said, "Margaret will use the next 2 days to build a case. She'll find witnesses to say the consent clause was understood by everyone to be a formality. She'll have time to construct a narrative." "That's right. And if I stay here, Lang will use it to question your character before the hearing." She looked at him directly. "Is there a third option?" He was quiet for a moment. "There's a boarding house on Maple Street, run by a woman named Clara Wells. She's respectable, she's known in town, and she doesn't have any connection to Lang or your stepmother." He paused. "I know her because she does the Calloway Ranch laundry. She's a fair woman." "Will she take me in on short notice?" "I'll ask her this morning." "Why would she help?" Daniel looked at her steadily. "Because I'll explain the situation, and because Clara Wells lost her first husband to a man very much like Victor Lang, and she has opinions about the matter." He picked up his hat from the fence post where it had landed when he came out. "Let me talk to her before you decide anything. Emily nodded, and then because the morning was still early and the fear of what Lang was capable of was very present, and she was tired in a way that sleep hadn't touched. She said, "Daniel." He stopped. "He's not going to stop at Messengers," she said. "No," Daniel said. "He's not." Clara Wells was a compact woman of about 50, with silver-streaked hair and the kind of face that had been through enough to arrive at a settled practical kindness on the other side of it. She listened to Daniel explain the situation at her kitchen table with her hands folded in front of her, and her expression thoughtful. And when he was done, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Bring her here." Emily arrived at the Wells boarding house at 8 in the morning, with the documents still folded against her chest and the $3.40 still in her boot, and Clara Wells took one look at her and said, "You look like you haven't had a decent night's sleep in about 6 years." "About that," Emily agreed. "Well, you can sleep when Thursday's done." Clara poured her coffee. "In the meantime, you're a paying guest in my establishment, and anyone who says otherwise can take it up with me." Daniel left them to it. Before he went, he said to Emily quietly enough that Clara was the only other person who could have heard, "I'll find out what he's planning. Don't go anywhere without telling Mrs. Wells first." "You don't need to." "I know I don't need to," he said. "I'm going to anyway." He left, and Clara Wells looked at Emily over her coffee cup and said, "Known him long." "Since yesterday morning," Emily said. Clara made a small sound that could have meant any number of things. "Some people you know for 30 years, and they're still strangers," she said. "Some people you know for a day." She set her cup down. "Let me see those documents." J. The day passed in a specific kind of suspended tension, the tension of people waiting for something to happen while understanding that preparing for it is the only productive use of the waiting. Clara read every document carefully, and with the focus of a woman who had spent years navigating her own legal difficulties and had learned to read legal language the way you learn a foreign language when your life depends on being fluent. When she was done, she folded them neatly and said, "Your father was a careful man." "He was," Emily said. "The consent clause is unambiguous." Clara tapped the paper. "The question is whether Lang's lawyer tries to argue the spirit of the clause versus the letter of it, which he will. And the judge, Calloway, is a letterman," Clara said with certainty. "He believes in what the document says, not what someone claims it was supposed to mean." She looked at Emily. "Your stepmother is the problem." "I know. She'll say you were consulted, that you agreed verbally, that the written consent was a technicality everyone understood was waived." "I never agreed to anything." "You need witnesses who can testify to your actual position, people who heard you say directly that you refused." Emily thought about the people of Red Hollow, the people who looked away, the people with the sympathy without commitment. "There's Briggs," she said. "He heard me tell him I had not consented. Briggs will testify to what he legally observed," Clara said carefully. "That's something." She paused. "Who else was there when you refused Lang directly?" "Daniel." Clara looked at her. "He was there in the store," Emily said. "When Lang came the second time, he heard everything." Clara nodded slowly. "Then you have the sheriff and a witness. That's not nothing." She folded the documents again. "Now tell me what you know about what Lang is likely to do between now and Thursday." What Lang did was move faster than either of them had anticipated. By midday, it was all over town. Emily heard about it from Clara, who heard about it from the woman who ran the post office, who heard about it from 3 different people within the space of an hour. The story being circulated was not what Lang's men had threatened that morning, not the simple implication about her staying at Calloway's ranch. It was more specific than that, and more damaging. The story was that Emily Carter had been conducting herself inappropriately with a hired hand for some time before the current situation arose. That her stepmother had been attempting to redirect her toward a respectable arrangement out of concern for her reputation. That the legal challenge to the debt contract, was not a young woman defending her rights, but a young woman guided by an unsuitable man attempting to subvert a legitimate financial obligation. It was elegant. She had to give him that. He had taken the true facts of the situation, the debt, the contract, Margaret's role, Daniel's involvement, and rearranged them into a story where Emily was not a woman defending herself, but a woman being manipulated, where her refusal was not courage, but weakness of a different kind, where the person she most needed the judge to see her as a young woman acting in clear-headed defense of her own legal rights was replaced by a girl who needed men to tell her what to do, just different men than the ones her stepmother had chosen. Emily sat in Clara's kitchen and listened to Clara report what was being said, and felt the specific cold fury of someone watching their own story be rewritten in real time. "He's good at this," she said. "He's had practice," Clara said. "This isn't the first time he's done something like this. The Whitmore woman 4 years ago, and before her, the Kellerman daughter." She paused. "Neither of them had documents like yours. Neither of them had anyone in their corner." Emily looked at the folded papers on the table. "What happened to them?" she said. Clara was quiet for a moment. "The Whitmore woman left town, the Kellerman daughter." Another pause. "She married him, the first wife." The kitchen was very still. Emily picked up the documents and put them inside her dress close against her body where they could not be taken. She felt the edge of the paper against her skin, and she thought about the Whitmore woman and the Kellerman daughter, and all the women who had not had a will with a consent clause written in their father's careful handwriting. "He won't do it to me," she said. It was not bravado. It was just the truth, stated the way the truth sometimes needs to be stated plainly, without decoration, because decoration would make it feel less certain than it was. Clara looked at her for a long moment. "No," she said. "I don't think he will." Daniel came back at 3 in the afternoon, with his jaw set in a way she hadn't seen before. She knew as soon as she saw him. "What happened?" she said. He came in and sat down at the kitchen table, and Clara poured him coffee without being asked. And he was quiet for long enough that Emily felt the specific dread of waiting for information she already understood was bad. "Lang went to the Calloway ranch this morning," he said, "after we left." "About what?" "He holds a note on the Calloway land. Small one. Calloway took out a short-term loan 2 years ago for equipment. Due next spring." Daniel turned the coffee cup in his hands. Lang told Calloway that if he wanted the note renewed on favorable terms, he might want to reconsider his association with certain people. Emily understood immediately. "He threatened Calloway's livelihood to get to you. He suggested Calloway release me from the seasonal hire." A beat. "Calloway told him to leave his property." She let out a breath she'd been holding. "Calloway didn't..." "No. But now Calloway has a problem that didn't exist yesterday. Because of me." He looked up. "Because of being connected to this." "Daniel, I'm not leaving," he said preemptively in the tone of a man closing a door. "That's not what I'm saying. I'm telling you what's happening so you understand what Lang is willing to do. He's not just coming at you. He's removing everyone around you." She sat down. Thought. "Briggs," she said. "Has he gone to Briggs?" "Not yet. But Briggs has a re-election coming up in the fall. Lang has money in this county and influence in the local party." He paused. "If Briggs decides Thursday morning that his testimony about what he heard is unclear or that he misremembers the specifics, we lose the witness who can contradict Margaret." "Yes." Clara sat down at the table too, which felt significant. The three of them in the small kitchen with the afternoon heat pressing in, working through the shape of a problem that kept expanding. "There's something else," Daniel said. He reached into his coat pocket and set a piece of paper on the table. "This was in the mail from the county seat when I stopped at the telegraph office. I wired for property records yesterday. This came back this morning." Emily looked at the paper. It was a partial record, a copy of a filing notation, the kind that referenced other filings. "Your father's original deed," Daniel said, was filed in 1869. The title transfer to Margaret was filed in 1873 under the probate case. But there's a second notation filed in 1874, a year after the title transfer that I didn't know about until this morning. He tapped the paper. Your father had a business partner for the first 2 years before the store was profitable. A man named Elias Grover. They dissolved the partnership in 1871, and Grover signed a release. But the release was filed incorrectly. The clerk at the time used the wrong case number. It's been sitting in the records misattributed for 20 years. Emily stared at him. What does that mean? It means there's a potential cloud on the title. A small one. The release was clearly executed, it was just misfiled. But Lang's lawyer will find it before Thursday. And if he does, he'll argue that the title itself is uncertain, which means the probate transfer is uncertain, which means your standing to invoke the consent clause is uncertain. The kitchen was very, very quiet. Very. He already knows, Emily said slowly. That's why he moved so fast today. He's not trying to discredit me to buy time. He already found the Grover filing. Daniel looked at her. That's what I think, yes. Clara stood up. We can fix the misfiled release, she said. A corrected filing at the county seat with the original release document attached. It would clean the title. She looked at Daniel. How long does it take to get to the county seat and back? Riding hard 1 day each way. Thursday is 2 days from now. Yes, Daniel said. So someone needs to leave today, Clara said. In the next hour. With the original dissolution agreement, if there is one, or a notarized affidavit explaining the misfiling and the corrected case reference, and get it filed at the county seat and back here by Wednesday night. Emily looked at Daniel. He looked at her. I'll go, he said. If you leave, you're not here, Emily said. If something happens tonight, tomorrow. Nothing's going to happen, he said. Lang sent 2 men to Calloway's ranch before sunrise this morning, she said. Don't tell me nothing's going to happen. He was quiet for a moment. She could see him working through it, the same careful, unhurried thinking she'd watched him do from the beginning, laying the variables next to each other and examining them. You're right, he said. I can't leave. Then who goes? Clara said. I have a nephew in town, Roy Wells. He's 24, he's steady, and he can ride. She paused. He'll do it if I ask him. Daniel thought. He needs to know exactly what to file and how to ask for it. This isn't a simple errand. Then you explain it to him, Clara said. Write it down, every step. Roy follows instructions well. Emily watched Daniel turn this over. She watched him decide. All right, he said. He pulled the papers toward him and picked up the pen Clara set beside them, and began writing in small, clear, deliberate letters every step Roy Wells would need to take at the County Land Records office in Millhaven. Emily watched his hands. She thought about her father writing her name into a will. She thought about the Whitmore woman and the Kellerman daughter. She thought about what Lang had done that day, methodically, systematically dismantling every person who had chosen to stand beside her threatening livelihoods, rewriting narratives, moving the ground under her feet. She thought about the fact that she was still standing on it. Daniel, she said. He looked up from writing. When this is over, she said. Whatever happens Thursday, I want you to know that I understand what you've risked, what you've put into this. She paused. I don't take it lightly. He looked at her for a moment. Something moved in his expression, not sentiment exactly, but something adjacent to it, something genuine and unperformed. I know you don't, he said. He went back to writing. And Emily Carter sat in Clara Wells's kitchen in the last hours of the first real day of her life, in which she had fought back, and she listened to the scratch of the pen on paper, and she prepared herself for what was coming. Roy Wells left at 5 o'clock with the papers, and Daniel's written instructions, and a canteen, and the particular determined expression of a young man who has been told something important is riding on him and has decided to be equal to it. They watched him go from Clara's front porch. He'll make it, Clara said. He has to, Emily said. That night Margaret came to the boarding house. Emily heard the knock at the front door, and heard Clara answer it, and heard the brief exchange of voices in the front hall, and then Clara appeared in the doorway of the sitting room, where Emily was going through the documents for the fourth time, and said in a carefully neutral voice, "Your stepmother is here." Emily set the papers down. Margaret came into the sitting room and looked around it, the respectability of Clara Wells's boarding house, the clean curtains, the evidence that Emily was not unhoused or unprotected, and Emily watched something shift in her stepmother's expression, some calculation being revised. "Sit down, Margaret," Emily said. It was the first time she had ever said her name to her face without Mrs. Voss. She hadn't planned it. It came out of the same place that No had come from this morning and this afternoon, and the time before that, some part of her that had been accumulating all 6 years of silence and had started today to spend the balance. Margaret sat. "Victor Lang came to see me this afternoon," Margaret said. Her voice was careful in a way it almost never was, not calculating careful. There was a difference. "He told me about the Grover filing." "I know about it too," Emily said. Margaret looked at her. Something crossed her face, surprise quickly suppressed. "He said it compromises the title, that the consent clause may not be enforceable." "He may believe that," Emily said. "He's wrong." "Emily, I've sent someone to the county seat to correct the misfiled release," Emily said. "It will be on record before Thursday. The title will be clean. The consent clause will stand." The silence went on long enough that Emily could hear the evening sounds outside. Horses' voices down the street. The ordinary sounds of Red Hollow going about its evening entirely unaware of what was happening in Clara Wells's sitting room. "He told me," Margaret said slowly, "that if I would provide a sworn statement that the consent clause was understood by both parties to be advisory only, that I had discussed it with you, and you had agreed in principle." "That's a lie," Emily said, "and you know it." "He said he would forgive the remaining debt entirely, not just settle it, forgive it. The store would be free and clear." The quiet stretched. Emily looked at her stepmother's face, not the controlled, calculating face of the woman who had come into their lives when Emily was 15 and immediately begun the process of consolidating every asset available to her. Not the hard face she had been looking at for 6 years. Something underneath that, something she had almost never seen. "You're scared of him," Emily said. Margaret didn't answer. "You know what he is," Emily said. "You've always known. You didn't care when it was me you were handing over. But now he's coming at you too, isn't he? The debt forgiveness offer that's not generosity. That's him buying your testimony so he can win Thursday, and you know it, and you know that once he wins, he doesn't need you anymore." Margaret's hands folded in her lap tightened. "I know." Emily said, "that you've never seen me as your daughter. I've made my peace with that. I'm not asking you to be something you're not." She leaned forward slightly. "I'm asking you to tell the truth on Thursday. Not for me. For yourself. Because Victor Lang will use you and discard you the same way he planned to use me, and the difference between us is that I have a legal document protecting me, and you have nothing but his word." The sitting room was very still. Margaret looked at her stepdaughter, really looked the way Emily had looked at her in the store that morning, the looking that meant actually seeing. And Emily looked back and did not look away. "I need to think," Margaret said finally. "Think fast," Emily said. "Thursday comes, whether you're ready for it or not." Margaret stood. She smoothed her dress. She walked to the door and then stopped her hand on the frame, her back to Emily, and said something so quietly that Emily almost didn't hear it. "Your father would have been proud of you." She left before Emily could answer. Emily sat alone in Clara Wells's sitting room with the documents in her lap and the evening sounds outside and the specific, complicated weight of 6 years sitting in her chest. And she breathed through it, and she did not fall apart. She heard the front door open a little later, heard Daniel's voice in the hall and Clara's, heard his boots on the floor coming toward the sitting room. He stopped in the doorway, looked at her. "Margaret was here," she said. "I know. I saw her leaving." He looked at her face. "You all right?" She thought about it honestly. "I will be," she said. He nodded once. He came in and sat down across from her, and neither of them said anything for a while, and outside the evening moved toward night. And somewhere between here and Millhaven, Roy Wells was riding hard through the dark, with papers that might hold everything together. And in 36 hours, a judge named Calloway would walk into the Red Hollow courthouse, and Emily Carter would stand in front of him. And whatever Victor Lang had spent 2 days building against her, she would stand in front of it. She was not all right yet, but she was still standing. And tomorrow, that was going to have to be enough. Roy Wells rode back into Red Hollow at 10:30 on Wednesday night. Emily heard the horse before she heard anything else, the particular rhythm of an animal that had been pushed hard and was coming in tired hooves on the dry road outside Clara's boarding house. And she was at the front door before Clara had even come out of the kitchen. She pulled it open, and Roy was already dismounting, dusty from the road and red-faced from the ride, and he reached into his coat and pulled out a folded document with the specific, careful gesture of someone who has been guarding something important for a long time and is very glad to finally put it down. "Filed and stamped," he said. "County clerk logged it at 4:15 this afternoon. The corrected reference is on record. The Grover release is properly attributed." Emily took the document. She read it in the light from the doorway. She read it twice. "You did it," she said. Roy looked like he might fall down, but he was smiling. "Yes, ma'am. Rode hard both ways." The clerk was, well, he wasn't thrilled about the correction request. At first said it would take a week to process, but I showed him Daniel's letter explaining the legal significance, and he changed his thinking pretty quick. Clara appeared beside Emily and took one look at Roy and said, "Get inside. There's food." Roy got inside. Emily stood in the doorway a moment longer, with the stamped document in her hands and the night air around her, and the specific quality of relief that comes not from a problem being solved, but from a weapon being removed from your enemy's hand before he can use it. The title was clean. The Grover cloud was gone. Come Thursday morning, Lang's lawyer would reach for that argument and find nothing there. One less weapon. She counted them the way she counted everything now, methodically, without sentiment, the way her father had taught her to run inventory. She went inside. Daniel was in the kitchen when she came in, sitting across from Roy, while Clara piled food onto a plate, and he looked up when Emily entered, and she held up the document. He read her face before he read the paper, and something in his expression settled, not relaxed. Settled the specific way a prepared man adjusts when one piece of the ground he's been standing on firms up under him. "Good," he said. That was all. But the way he said it covered more than the word. She sat down. Roy was eating with the focus of someone who had forgotten food existed for 18 hours. Clara poured coffee for everyone. For a few minutes the kitchen was quiet, in the way that kitchens get quiet when people who have been through something hard together find themselves briefly in the same room with enough food and enough time to breathe. Then Daniel said, "Lang knows Roy went to Millhaven." Emily looked up. "How?" "Because this is a small town, and someone saw him leave yesterday, and someone else saw which direction he rode." He turned his coffee cup. "He'll know what it means. He's been planning around the Grover filing, counting on it to complicate your standing. He finds out tonight that it's been corrected. He changes his approach," Emily said. "He's been changing it all day." Daniel set the cup down. "There's something I need to tell you. I found out this afternoon, and I waited because I wanted to confirm it before I said anything." The kitchen got very still. "Briggs came to see me at the Calloway ranch," Daniel said. "Around 4 o'clock. He came himself, not through anyone else." "What did he want?" "To tell me that Lang's lawyer filed a motion with the circuit court this afternoon. A pre-hearing motion." He paused. "Requesting that Judge Calloway recuse himself from the case on the grounds of a prior professional relationship." Emily set her coffee down very carefully. "What prior relationship?" 14 years ago, before Calloway was a judge, he was a practicing attorney. He represented a client in a land dispute against Lang's father. The case was decided against the Lang family. Daniel looked at her steadily. "Lang's lawyer is arguing that this constitutes bias." "That's..." She stopped, pressed her hands flat on the table. That's 14 years ago. That's a different case. That's not— No, Daniel said. It's not a strong motion. But it doesn't need to be strong. It only needs to delay. If Calloway recuses, the next available circuit judge comes through in 3 weeks. 3 weeks. 3 weeks of Lang moving pieces around the board. 3 weeks of Margaret's position potentially changing. 3 weeks of Roy Wells's stamped document sitting in the county records while Lang found something else to use. Will Calloway recuse? She said. Briggs doesn't think so. He said Calloway's reputation is exactly that, a man who doesn't run from cases because they're uncomfortable. But he also said to be prepared for a delay motion argument first thing tomorrow morning before any testimony. Roy had stopped eating. Clara had sat down. All 4 of them were at the table now, in the specific way of people who understand that the shape of the problem has just changed again. What does Briggs want? Emily said. He didn't come to tell you that out of the goodness of his heart. Daniel was quiet for a half-beat. He wants to know if he's going to be standing on the right side of this when it's over. He's up for re-election in the fall. He heard about the recusal motion, and he started thinking about what happens if Calloway stands firm and rules against Lang. And he's been the kind of sheriff who watched what was happening to you for 2 days and did the minimum. He paused. He's nervous. He should be nervous, Emily said. He asked if there was anything he could do. Emily looked at Daniel. She thought about Briggs standing outside the barber shop 2 days ago with his careful neutrality and his process and his looking at Cal Merritt instead of at her. She thought about what it cost a person to spend years doing the minimum and then needing something from someone they'd minimized. Tell him to show up tomorrow, she said. Tell him to stand where I can see him, and tell him to remember exactly what he heard word for word with no uncertainty. She paused. That's what he can do. Daniel nodded once. I'll tell him, he said. She did not sleep that night. She lay in the hired girl's room. Clara had brought her back to the ranch for safety, away from town, away from Lang's reach, and she stared at the ceiling, and she went through every piece of the case, the way she'd learned to do with the store inventory, item by item, checking for gaps. The corrected Grover filing. The original will. The consent clause language. Roy's stamped document. Briggs's testimony. Daniel as witness. Against that, Lang's lawyer. The recusal motion. Lang's money. Lang's influence. 20 years of this county learning to accommodate Victor Lang's wishes because accommodation was easier than resistance. And Margaret. She kept coming back to Margaret, to what her stepmother had said, standing in the doorway of Clara's sitting room. Your father would have been proud of you. To the way she'd said it quietly with her back turned, in the voice of someone putting something down they'd been carrying for a long time. Emily didn't know what Margaret would do tomorrow. She had no way of knowing. Margaret Voss was a woman who had survived by calculating every move, and the calculus of tomorrow was genuinely uncertain. Lang's protection, or Emily's truth, and which one came out ahead, depended on a judge neither of them fully controlled. She could not count on Margaret. She told herself that clearly in the dark, so she didn't make the mistake of hoping for something she didn't have. She thought about her father. She thought about him at his desk in the back room of the store she'd swept since she was 16, writing her name into a document 18 months before he died. She thought about what it meant to love someone carefully, not loudly, not dramatically, but in the specific way of a person who sees the danger coming and does the quiet, practical thing to protect the person they love while they still can. She thought, I understand you now. I didn't when I was 16. I do now. She thought, I'm going to be all right. She thought, I am going to be all right. She believed it by the 3rd time she'd said it, which was enough to get her through to morning. Ahmed. The Red Hollow Courthouse was not a large building, but it had the specific weight of a place where significant things had happened, the accumulated gravity of decisions made and recorded and lived with. The hearing room held maybe 60 people if they pressed together. And by the time Emily arrived with Daniel at 8:45, it was already close to full. She had not expected that. She had expected a procedural hearing. She had expected lawyers and a judge, and Margaret and Lang, and the particular sterile machinery of legal process. She had not expected to walk in and find that half of Red Hollow had apparently decided that this was worth getting up early for. She recognized faces. Mrs. Hale, who bought salt and flour at the store. Old Pete Dugan with his rope. 3 women from the church. The man who ran the feed store. People who had come into Voss General Store for 6 years and looked at Emily Carter with sympathy without commitment. They were looking at her now. She kept her chin level and her eyes forward, and she walked to the front of the room and sat in the chair that had been indicated and put her hands in her lap and held them still. Daniel sat directly behind her. She could feel him there, the way she'd felt him in the store when Lang came the second time, that specific quality of solid presence not performing anything, just there. She did not turn around. She didn't need to. Lang was already at the opposite table with his lawyer, a man named Prescott, who had come up from the county seat and wore his suit with the confidence of someone accustomed to courtrooms. Lang himself was composed, expensive, correct, the same presentation he always had, the same clean hands, the same deliberate cost of everything he wore. He did not look at Emily when she sat down. That was interesting. 2 days ago, he'd looked at her across the store counter with that flat, certain expression. Today, he was not looking at her at all. She filed that away. Judge Calloway came in at 9 o'clock exactly. He was older than she had expected, late 60s, with a spare, angular face and the deliberate movements of a man who had learned that haste in a courtroom produced reversible decisions. He sat. He looked at the papers in front of him. He looked at Prescott's table. He looked at Emily. "I've reviewed the pre-hearing motion filed yesterday afternoon by counsel for Victor Lang," he said. His voice was dry and precise. "Requesting recusal on grounds of prior professional relationship. I will address that first." Prescott stood. He was smooth and practiced, and he laid out the argument cleanly. The 14-year-old case, the Lang family, the adverse decision, the potential for residual bias. He was careful not to claim bias directly, only to suggest that the appearance of impartiality might be served by Mr. Prescott, the judge said. Prescott stopped. "I have been on the circuit for 11 years, Calloway said. "In that time I have recused myself from cases twice, once because the defendant was my wife's cousin, and once because I had a direct financial interest in the outcome. In this matter, I represented a client in a contract dispute against the Lang family's business interests 14 years ago in a completely unrelated matter in a different county. The motion is denied. We will proceed." He looked at his papers. "Now, the question before this court is the enforceability of a debt contract secured against property held under a will with a specific consent requirement. Counsel, you may proceed." Prescott sat down. He did it smoothly, professionally, without any visible indication that the first piece of ground had just been cut from under him. Emily breathed. The first hour was procedural and dense, and she followed every word of it with the focus of someone who understood that the words were all that mattered. Prescott argued that the consent clause was advisory, not mandatory, that the language "shall require" was conventional boilerplate that the parties had understood to be recommendatory. He cited 3 precedents. He was good. She could see why Lang had brought him up from the county seat. Her lawyer, a young man named Arthur Greer, whom Clara had produced on Wednesday morning with the information that he was fresh from law school in St. Louis, had 3 months of practice and was the only attorney in Red Hollow who did not owe Victor Lang anything, stood up and said that the language of the will was unambiguous and that the precedents cited by opposing counsel applied to commercial partnership agreements, not testamentary provisions, and that the distinction was legally significant. Calloway asked 3 questions, sharp ones, the kind of questions that told Emily he had already read the will carefully and was testing both lawyers' understanding of it rather than seeking information he didn't have. Greer answered 2 of the 3 questions well. The third he fumbled slightly, and Emily felt the specific cold pulse of watching a young man reach for something just past his grasp. But Calloway moved on without comment, and she could not read his face, and she gripped her hands in her lap and waited. Then Prescott introduced his witness. Margaret Voss walked to the front of the courtroom with her back straight and her expression composed, and she did not look at Emily. Prescott asked her about the consent clause. He asked whether in her understanding, as the party to the debt contract, the clause had been discussed with Emily Carter. Margaret said yes. He asked whether Emily Carter had indicated agreement with the arrangement in principle. Margaret said. She stopped. The courtroom noticed. Prescott noticed. The pause was not long. 2 seconds, perhaps 3. But in a quiet room, 2 seconds is an enormous amount of time. And in those 2 seconds, Emily watched her stepmother's hands tighten on the railing in front of her, and watched her eyes move involuntarily to a point just past Emily's right shoulder, and then come back. "Mrs. Voss," Prescott said carefully. "Did Emily Carter indicate agreement with the arrangement in principle?" Margaret looked at him. She looked at Lang. Lang was looking at her with the flat gray eyes of a man whose patience had very precise limits. She looked at Emily. Emily did not move. She did not nod or shake her head or make any gesture. She looked at her stepmother's face, and she waited. The way she had waited for 6 years, and this time, the waiting felt different. Not the waiting of someone who has no power, but the waiting of someone who has handed another person exactly one chance and is watching to see what they do with it. "She said no," Margaret said. The room went very still. "She told me clearly that she did not consent and would not consent," Margaret said. Her voice was even and clear and carried to every corner of the room. "On the morning of July 15th, before the contract was signed, I proceeded without her consent." Prescott said, "Mrs. Voss, I am answering the question," Margaret said. She was still looking at Emily. Emily Carter did not agree. She refused. The contract was executed without the legally required consent of the heir of record. That is the truth. Prescott turned to the judge and opened his mouth. "Sit down, Mr. Prescott," Calloway said. His voice had not changed in volume or inflection. It didn't need to. "We'll hear from the next witness." Briggs testified for 11 minutes. He was precise and factual, and he did not hedge. He testified that Emily Carter had come to him on the morning of July 15th and stated clearly that she had not consented to any arrangement with Victor Lang, and that she was seeking information about her legal standing to refuse. He testified that he had observed nothing to suggest coercion or outside influence on Miss Carter's position. He testified that her refusal had been unambiguous. When Prescott cross-examined him, Briggs said, "I told you what I saw and heard, Mr. Prescott. I don't have anything to add to it." Prescott tried twice more. Briggs answered the same way both times. Then Daniel testified. He walked to the front of the courtroom with the same unhurried quality he brought to everything, sat down, and answered every question in the same direct, unembellished way he did everything. He had heard Emily Carter refuse Victor Lang's proposal in those words on 2 separate occasions. He had heard Lang threaten legal action in response to her refusal. He had made no agreements on Emily's behalf and had no financial or personal interest in the property in question. Prescott asked him how long he had known Emily Carter. 2 days, Daniel said. "And in that time you became sufficiently involved in her affairs to—" "I was asked for help by someone who needed it," Daniel said. "I provided it. That's the whole of my involvement." Prescott looked at him for a moment. Something in the way Daniel sat still unbothered, giving Prescott exactly the words he'd asked for, and not one more seemed to deflate whatever line of argument the lawyer had been reaching for. "No further questions," Prescott said. Then Emily testified. She had been dreading it, and she had been preparing for it simultaneously, and the combination had produced in her something that was neither calm nor panic, but a focused state just past both of them. She sat down. She looked at Arthur Greer. He asked her about the morning of July 15th, and she told it all of it from Margaret's announcement to Lang's arrival to her conversation with Sheriff Briggs to the store counter where she had said no, and Lang had said, "Then, I will have the sheriff explain the law to you." Prescott cross-examined her for 20 minutes. He was skilled, and he was persistent, and he tried 4 different approaches. Her relationship with Daniel, the duration of her residence under Margaret's roof, the question of whether she had ever verbally agreed to any arrangement in any form, And she answered each one the same way directly, without ornamentation, without anger, without the kind of emotional display that could be used to suggest instability. She had spent 6 years learning not to display what she was feeling. For the first time in 6 years, that skill was working for her instead of against her. When Prescott finally sat down, she was still seated at the front of the room, and she looked at Judge Calloway. And Calloway looked at her, and she had the impression she could not have explained why that he had already decided. The judge took 40 minutes. He went to his chambers at 11:15 and came back at 5 minutes to noon, and in the room that had gone taut with waiting, he sat and arranged his papers and spoke for 7 minutes in the dry, precise voice that never rose or fell, regardless of what it was saying. The debt contract executed by Margaret Lena Voss on July 15, 1879, secured against the property of Voss General Store, was invalid. The consent clause in the will of Thomas George Carter was a mandatory testamentary provision, not a recommendation. The failure to obtain the written consent of Emily Jean Carter, heir of record, rendered the contract unenforceable as a matter of law. The debt itself remained. Lang was owed money, and the judge was clear that this was not in dispute, but the security against the property was void, and Lang's claim on the property, or on Emily Carter's person or service in settlement of that debt, had no legal standing. Victor Lang would need to pursue collection of the underlying debt through standard civil channels without the property as collateral and without Emily Carter. He signed the order. He set down his pen. He looked up once briefly at Emily, just a look, just a moment of direct contact, the look of a man who has done his job and knows he has done it correctly. Then he gathered his papers and left. The room exhaled. Emily sat for a moment without moving, because her legs were not entirely certain they would hold her, and she wanted to be sure before she stood. She heard Prescott's voice low and controlled, and Lang's voice lower. And then she heard Lang's chair push back, and she turned because she needed to see it. She needed to see him standing up in a room where he had not gotten what he came for. He was looking at her, not with the flat gray certainty she'd been looking at for 2 days. Something else, something harder to name, and she understood instinctively that she did not want to give it a name, that some things were better left unnamed and simply survived. She held his gaze for exactly long enough to make clear that she was not looking away. And then she looked away herself, because she was done with him. And looking away from a man you have defeated is not weakness. It is the specific freedom of someone who no longer needs to watch the door. She stood up. Daniel was there. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He was just there the same way he'd been there since the morning she'd walked into him in the street, steady and unperforming and present, and she thought that she would have gotten through this without him. She believed that she needed to believe that, but she was glad she hadn't had to. "It's done," she said. "It's done," he said. Clara appeared from the crowd and took Emily's hands in both of hers and squeezed hard, the grip of a woman who understood exactly what had just happened and what it had taken. Roy Wells was behind her, still tired from the ride, grinning. Arthur Greer was shaking his own hand, which struck Emily as both odd and entirely correct for a young man who had just won his first real case. She looked around this room, the people of Red Hollow standing in small groups talking in low voices. Mrs. Hale, Old Pete, the women from the church, people who had watched for 6 years and done nothing, who had come today to watch some more, and who had, whether they'd intended to or not, become witnesses to something that could not now be undone. Margaret was near the back wall. Emily walked to her. She heard the shift in the room as she did, the slight change in the attention of the people around them, the instinctive awareness of a significant exchange about to happen. She stood in front of her stepmother. Margaret looked at her. Her face was complicated in a way Emily had never seen it. Not the calculating face, not the hard face. Something underneath both of those, something that was perhaps what Margaret Voss looked like when she had nothing left to manage. "The store," Emily said. "Under the will it comes to me when you die or remarry. That hasn't changed." "I know." In the meantime, it's still yours to operate." She paused. "I'll keep working there. For fair wages. Paid to me directly." Another pause. "That's the arrangement I'm offering." Margaret was quiet for a moment. "That's generous," she said. "Given. It's practical," Emily said. "I know the store. I know the accounts. I know every supplier and every customer. Running it without me would cost you more than paying me." She let that settle. "It's not generosity. It's business." Something moved across Margaret's face. Not quite a smile. Not quite anything Emily had a name for. "Your father taught you well," she said. "He did," Emily said. "Eventually I learned it." She turned. She walked back through the room and the people made way for her, and she came out of the Red Hollow courthouse into the July heat, the same heat that had pressed down on her 2 days ago when she'd walked into a stranger in the street and told him she was not all right, and she stood in it and she breathed it, and it was the same heat it had always been, but she was not the same person standing in it. Daniel came out behind her. They stood side by side without speaking for a moment in the full press of the afternoon, and she felt the weight she had been carrying for 6 years, the weight she had been so practiced at carrying that she'd forgotten it was a weight shift, just slightly like something beginning to loosen. "What do you do now?" she said. "When the seasonal hire at Callaway's ends?" He was quiet for a moment. "Move on generally. There's usually work somewhere on the next range." "Usually," she said. "Usually," he agreed. She looked out at the street. At the store with the faded lettering. At the town that had watched and not acted, and then come to the courthouse anyway, because some part of people, even the parts that had learned to look away, wanted to see the right thing happen. She thought about the store that was going to be hers. She thought about fair wages, and accounts she already knew, and customers she'd served for 6 years, who might given time learn to see her differently now that she had made it impossible for them to look away. She thought about the fact that she had never, not once, in 6 years, had anyone in her corner. And that now she had Clara Wells, and Roy Wells, and Arthur Greer, and Briggs, who was going to be a better sheriff going forward, because he'd been afraid of being a worse one, and standing beside her in the heat quiet and present, and entirely himself, Daniel Hayes. "There's a position," she said carefully, "at the store, managing the supply orders and the delivery schedule. It's not cattle work, it pays less than a drive." She kept her eyes on the street. "But it's steady, and Red Hollow is not a bad place to be when it's not actively terrible." The silence went on long enough that she thought she'd miscalculated, that she'd misread what the last 2 days had been, that she'd taken something that was one man's decent instinct and turned it into something she wanted it to be. Then Daniel Hayes said, "I reckon I could look at the accounts first." She turned and looked at him. He was looking at her with that expression she had been trying to categorize since the morning she'd met him. That quiet, unperforming expression that didn't give you more than it meant, but meant every bit of what it gave. And she understood now that she was never going to be able to put it in a category, because it wasn't a type of expression she had encountered before. It was just his. "The accounts are in good order," she said. "I keep them myself." "I figured," he said. She almost smiled. It was the closest she'd come to smiling in 2 days, and she let it go just slightly, just enough because she had won today, and the sun was still up, and she was still standing in it, and some things deserved a smile, even a small one. "Come on then," she said. "I'll show you the store." The store looked different when she walked back into it that afternoon. Nothing had changed. The shelves were where they'd always been. The counter was where it had always been. The ledger sat in its place. The smell of dry goods and wood and the particular dusty warmth of a July afternoon in an enclosed space was exactly what it had always been. Nothing was different. She was different. That was the thing. She walked through the same door she'd walked through 10,000 times before, and the room arranged itself differently around her, because she was standing in it differently. Not in the posture of someone who had learned to take up as little space as possible, but in the posture of someone who knew legally and specifically that this room was going to be hers. Daniel came in behind her. He looked around the way he looked at everything methodically, without comment cataloging. Margaret was behind the counter. She had gotten back before them, which surprised Emily until she realized it shouldn't have. Margaret was a woman who had spent 30 years staying ahead of situations, and returning to the store to be already present when Emily arrived was exactly the move Margaret would make. They looked at each other. "The Hendersons came in while I was gone," Margaret said as if the morning had been a routine errand. "Wanted their usual flour order. I told them you'd have it ready by tomorrow." Emily crossed to the counter. She looked at the ledger open to today's date and saw Margaret's handwriting noting the Henderson order. Neat, precise, correct. "I'll have it ready," Emily said. Margaret looked at Daniel briefly, the way she'd looked at him in the courthouse, that complicated expression that was not quite anything Emily had a name for. Then she picked up her shawl from the hook and said, "I'll be back in the morning," and walked out. The door swung shut behind her. Daniel said, "She's not what I expected." "She's exactly what she's always been," Emily said. "She just recalculated." She opened the ledger to the accounts page. She ran her finger down the columns. Everything was where she'd put it. Everything was in order. She had kept these accounts in order through 6 years of Margaret's management, and she would keep them in order now, and in a year or 5 years, or however long it took when the store was legally hers, it would be in better shape because she had never stopped treating it as something worth maintaining. "Here," she said, turning the ledger so Daniel could see. She walked him through it, the supplier accounts, the credit customers, the outstanding orders, the seasonal patterns. He asked 3 questions, all of them precise, all of them showing that he'd processed what she'd said before asking. She answered each one. When she was done, he was quiet for a moment. Then, "The Henderson account is overextended." She looked. He was right. She had been watching the Henderson account with concern for 2 months, but with everything else happening, she hadn't addressed it. "I know. I've been meaning to speak with Mr. Henderson about a payment schedule." "Do it before the end of the month. If it goes another 30 days. "I know," she said again, and she meant it as agreement, not dismissal. And from the slight ease in his expression, she could tell he understood the difference. "I've been a little occupied." Something shifted in his face that might on a less composed man have been the beginning of a smile. "Somewhat," he said. She closed the ledger. She stood behind the counter that was going to be hers, and she looked at this man who had walked into 2 days of her life and changed the entire shape of what those days became. And she said, "You don't have to decide tonight. About the position. I meant it as a real offer. Not, I wasn't asking you to commit to something because of what happened this week. That's not. I know what you were asking," he said. "I just want to be sure that it's clear, Emily." He said her name for the first time. Not Miss Carter, which is what he'd called her for 2 days, but her name, and it was quiet and direct, and it stopped her the way he sometimes stopped her. Not by force, just by the specific gravity of his attention landing fully on a thing. "I'll look at the position. Give me a week to finish out the Callaway hire. Then I'll come back and we'll talk about it properly." "A week," she said. "A week," he said. She nodded. That was enough. That was more than enough. She was not a person who needed more than what was actually offered, and what was actually offered was a man saying he would come back, and she believed him. And that was something she was going to have to sit with carefully, because believing someone would come back was a thing she had learned not to do. She was going to have to learn it again. "All right," she said. "A week." The week passed, the way weeks pass after a significant event, strange and uneven with moments of flatness where life resumed its ordinary texture, and moments of sudden intensity where the memory of what had happened crashed back in unexpectedly. Lang left Red Hollow on Friday. She heard about it from Clara, who heard about it from the postmaster. He had packed his household, loaded his wagon, and gone south before noon. Whether he was gone permanently or merely retreating to reassess, no one in Red Hollow could say for certain, and Emily found she didn't need to know. He was gone. He wasn't here. What he did next was a problem for another day, and she had enough problems for today. The store operated. She served customers. She ordered supplies. She spoke with Mr. Henderson about a payment schedule, and he was embarrassed and grateful and promised to make the first payment by the end of the month. And she believed him because she could read people's honesty and their embarrassment, the same way she'd learned to read Margaret's moods in the way she set down her coffee cup. Margaret came in every morning. They did not speak much. Not yet. There was too much weight in the space between them, too much that had not been said in 6 years, and could not be said all at once now. But the silences between them had changed. They were no longer the silences of a woman managing a transaction. They were something more uncomfortable and more honest than that which Emily thought was probably the right direction. On the third day, Margaret said without preamble, "I knew about the will from the day he died." Emily was counting inventory. She didn't stop counting. "I know. I should have told you." "Yes." Margaret was quiet. "I thought if you knew—" She stopped, started again. "I thought if you knew the store was eventually yours, you'd be gone the moment you turned 18. And I needed—" Another stop. The sound of someone trying to be precise about a thing they haven't allowed themselves to be precise about before. "I needed someone to run it. Someone who knew it the way you knew it. I didn't know how to run it myself, and I couldn't admit that, so You kept me here by keeping me ignorant," Emily said. "Yes." She set down the inventory sheet. She turned. Margaret was at the counter, her hands flat on the surface, her eyes not quite meeting Emily's. "Did you think I wouldn't have stayed anyway?" Emily said. "If you'd told me the truth, if you'd said this store is going to be yours, help me keep it going until then, did you think I would have said no?" Margaret was quiet for a long time. "I didn't know," she said finally. "I didn't know you well enough to know." Emily looked at her stepmother's face. That complicated, stripped of management face, the one she'd been glimpsing more often this week. "You still don't," she said. "But we have time." She picked up the inventory sheet. Margaret said nothing, but she stayed. Daniel came back on the 8th day, one day past the week he'd said, and Emily did not comment on the extra day because she was not someone who marked time against people like that. He came into the store in the mid-morning when she was alone, and he leaned against the counter the way he'd leaned in the courthouse doorway, easy and unhurried. "How's the Henderson account?" he said. "First payment came in yesterday," she said. "Good." She closed the ledger. She looked at him. He looked back. Neither of them was pretending that this was a casual conversation about accounts, which meant it was exactly what she'd learned. His conversations usually were the thing being discussed directly without detour. "Calloway's settled," she said. "Finished up the drive, got paid, square with the ranch." He paused. "I spoke with Calloway about the note Lang holds. He's looking into refinancing it elsewhere. Should be clear of Lang's interest within the month." She hadn't known he'd done that. "You talked to him about it?" "He did me a favor by not releasing me when Lang asked him to. Seemed right to help him get clear." She looked at him for a moment. This was the thing about Daniel Hayes that she had been cataloging since the morning she'd met him, and still did not entirely have language for the way his decency operated. Not as performance, but as reflex. The way doing right by people was not something he decided, but something he simply did. The way breathing was simply done. "The position," she said. "It's real. I've spoken with Margaret, and she agrees we need someone managing the supply orders and delivery schedule, and it needs to be someone who can be trusted with the accounts." "What does Margaret think of it being me?" "She thinks you're an unknown quantity who did her stepdaughter a considerable service and may or may not be reliable long-term." Emily paused. Her words. "That's fair," Daniel said. She also said, and I am repeating this because it's relevant, that she has no objection provided the arrangement is professional and the accounts stay in the order they're currently in. "I can keep accounts in order." "I know you can." She hesitated. Then, "Daniel, why Red Hollow? You could find supply work at a ranch. You could go north on the next drive. Why here?" He was quiet for a moment. The morning sounds of the town came through the walls. Horses' voices, the ordinary percussion of a place going about its business. He looked at her, with that steady, unperforming directness, and he said, "Because when I rode in 11 days ago, this was just another stop on the road. And now it isn't." She held that for a moment. She turned it over carefully, the way she turned over everything she wanted. Too much examining it, looking for the gap between what it seemed to be and what it was. She didn't find one. "All right," she said. "The pay is $12 a month. You'll take the supply runs to Millhaven twice a month and manage the vendor accounts. You report to me on the accounts and to Margaret on the daily operations until the arrangement has been established long enough for Margaret to be comfortable with the division." "That's fair," he said. "It is," she agreed. "And Daniel, this is a working arrangement. That's what it is." "I know what it is," he said. And then, with the same directness he brought to everything, "And I know it might become something else eventually. If that's all right to say." She had known it was coming. She had known it the way you know a change in weather, not the details, just the shape of it moving toward you. She had prepared herself to be measured about it, to be careful to say something that acknowledged it without committing to more than she was ready to commit to. What she said was, "It's all right to say," which was not measured, which was simply true. He nodded once. He picked up his hat. "I'll start Monday," he said, "if that works." "Monday works," she said. He left. The door swung shut. Emily Carter stood behind the counter of Voss General Store in the summer heat of Red Hollow, Texas. And she held her hand still, and she breathed, and she allowed herself, for exactly the length of one full breath, to feel what she actually felt, which was the specific, unfamiliar, slightly terrifying warmth of something beginning. Then she opened the ledger. There was work to do. 3 weeks after the hearing, a letter arrived from Victor Lang's lawyer. She opened it herself in the store on a Tuesday morning when Margaret was in the back and Daniel was out on the Millhaven supply run. She read it standing at the counter, and when she was done, she read it again, and then she set it down flat on the wood surface and looked at it. Lang was suing for the underlying debt. Not the property, not the contract the judge had voided, but the original loan amount, $312, including accumulated interest, which he was claiming was owed by the estate of Thomas Carter, and therefore collectible against the property, regardless of the security agreement. He was not done. She had known he was not done. She had told herself he was not done. She had, in fact, specifically deliberately prepared herself for the knowledge that he was not done, and still the letter sat on the counter like a stone dropped into still water, and she felt the rings spread outward from it, and she breathed through them. She picked up the letter. She walked to the back room. "Margaret," she said, "we have a problem." Margaret read the letter. Her face went through 3 expressions in quick succession, and the third one settled steeled. Something hardening into place was one Emily recognized because she had seen it in herself in the courthouse. The expression of a woman who has decided that a thing is not going to happen and is beginning to work backwards from that decision. "Greer," Margaret said. "We need Arthur Greer." "I've already been thinking about Greer," Emily said. "But this is a different kind of case. The debt claim has merit, the loan was real. The question is whether it's collectible against the property under the terms of the will. Is it?" Emily had been thinking about this since she finished reading the letter. "I don't know. The will specifies that I'm the heir of record upon your death or remarriage. It doesn't speak to existing debt obligations." She paused. "If the debt predates the will's provisions taking effect, Lang might have a claim." "He's counting on that," Margaret said. "Yes." Margaret looked at the letter. Something moved across her face, not the complicated, stripped expression of recent days, but the older, calculating face, the face Emily had spent 6 years being managed by. Except this time, it was not being turned on Emily. "I have a letter," Margaret said, "from your father, written the year before he died." Emily went very still. "He wrote to me about the partnership dissolution with Elias Grover. He wrote about the store's debt structure. He wrote—" Margaret stopped. "He wrote about why he included the consent clause in the will. He was specific about his intentions. He was clear that no debt incurred after the dissolution of the Grover partnership should be collectible against the property without Emily's written consent, because the property was being held in trust for her. Emily stared at her. "You've had that letter for 6 years." "Yes." "And you didn't—" She stopped herself, took a breath, took another one. "Where is it?" "In the strongbox in my room at the house," Margaret said. "I kept every letter your father wrote to me. I don't know why I kept them. I don't know—" She stopped again. "I didn't think they would matter. I didn't think any of it would matter because I didn't think you'd ever—" She looked up. "I underestimated you. From the beginning." The back room was very quiet. Emily thought about 6 years. She thought about her father writing letters to a woman who had kept them in a strongbox and not used them, and not shared them, and carried them around like objects she couldn't explain her attachment to. She thought about love as a complicated and imperfect thing that did not always show itself in the ways it should. She thought about her father seeing both things at once, Margaret's nature and Emily's future, and doing what he could with the tools available to him. "Get the letter," Emily said. "Today. I need it before I speak to Greer." Margaret nodded. She was already moving. Say. Arthur Greer read the letter twice, then a third time, and his expression on the third read was the expression of a young attorney who has just found the piece that makes the puzzle entirely clear. "This establishes testamentary intent," he said. "Your father specified in writing to his wife before the will was finalized that the property was being preserved for you and that no debt should be collectible against it without your consent. That's not just explanatory context. In combination with the will's language, it's a complete statement of intent." He looked at Emily. "Lang's debt claim assumes the property is available collateral. This letter combined with the will establishes that it never was." "Can he still sue for the debt itself?" Emily said. "He can sue for the money. He can get a judgment for the money. But he cannot collect that judgment against this property. He'd have to collect against your stepmother's other assets, and from what I understand of Mrs. Voss's financial position, that conversation would be short." Emily looked at Margaret, who was sitting beside her, with her hands folded in exactly the composed posture she'd maintained through everything, the posture of a woman who had learned a long time ago that composure was the only armor reliably available. "It's over," Emily said. Not a question. Just checking the shape of it. "It's over," Greer said. "File your response. Attach the letter. Cite the testamentary intent precedent. I'll pull from St. Louis case law, and Lang's lawyer will know within a week that there's nowhere left to go." Margaret said quietly, "I should have given you the letter years ago." "Yes," Emily said. "You should have." "I know." They sat with that. The two of them in Greer's small office, with the letter on the table between them, and 6 years, and everything that had happened in the last 3 weeks, and everything that hadn't happened in the years before, that all of it present, all of it real, all of it unable to be undone. "We go forward," Emily said finally. "That's all we do now. Forward." Margaret nodded. "Forward," she said. So, Daniel came back from Millhaven on Thursday, with the supply wagon full, and the vendor receipts in order, and a small package he set on the counter. Without comment, a book she discovered when she opened it, a practical guide to business accounting published in St. Louis, that she had mentioned once in passing as something she'd heard existed. She looked at the book. She looked at him. "You remembered that," she said. "I remember most things," he said. He began unloading the receipts, putting them in the correct order without being told what the correct order was, because he had been watching how she organized them and had applied the observation. That was another thing about him she had catalogued, and still didn't have full language for the attentiveness that never called attention to itself. She told him about the letter and Lang's lawsuit and Greer's assessment. He listened without interrupting. When she was done, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "It's finished then." "It will be," she said, "when the response is filed." "When it's filed," he said. "Yes." He looked at her. "How are you?" She considered the question the way she always did with him, honestly, because he asked it the way he asked everything, meaning to know the answer. "I'm tired," she said. There's a kind of tired that's not about sleep, where you've been holding something for so long that even when you put it down, your arms still remember the weight. Yes, he said. I know that kind. I think it'll take a while, she said, before I stop feeling like I need to brace for something. That's all right, he said. Take the time it takes. She looked at him. This man who had walked into her life on a Tuesday morning in July when she had 2 hours and $3.40 and nowhere to go. This man who had asked the right questions and stayed and come back and remembered a book she'd mentioned once in passing. Daniel, she said. He looked up. I'm glad I ran into you, she said. In the street, that morning. He held her gaze for a moment. That quiet, unperforming, entirely present look. So am I, he said. She opened the accounting book. She set it on the counter next to the ledger. She ran her hand over the cover, feeling the solidity of it, real and useful, and hers. Outside, Red Hollow went about its Thursday. Inside the store, the accounts were in order. The vendor receipts were filed correctly. The Henderson payment was logged. The letter that had been sitting in a strongbox for 6 years was in the hands of an attorney who knew what to do with it, and Victor Lang was running out of ground to stand on, and Margaret Voss was in the back room taking inventory with the focused efficiency of a woman who has decided that forward is the only direction left. And Emily Carter was standing behind the counter of a store that was going to be hers, next to a man who had chosen to be here in a town that had watched her fight for herself and would not forget that it had seen it. She was 22 years old, and she had $3.40 that she no longer needed to keep hidden in her boot, and a legal document with her name in her father's handwriting and work she was good at, and a life she had refused to let anyone take from her. She was not a debt to be settled. She was not a transaction to be completed. She was not a line item on anyone's ledger. She was Emily Jean Carter, and in Red Hollow, Texas in the summer of 1879, that was finally completely and irrevocably enough.